Hello, parents and guardians, and welcome back to another Discipleship Debrief. So this past Sunday, our youth group did the entirety of Mark chapter 13, and if you know the chapter of Mark chapter 13, you'll know that that was quite the undertaking. Eh, And so we actually decided to kind of break it up as more of a generalization, more of a general teaching on the end times and a general summary of how Christ himself taught on the end times. And so we broke it up into three sections. We talked about how Christ's teaching on the end times is solid on the fact that he will come back, solid on the fact that we can't know when, therefore we ought not be deceived by people who say they do, and solid on the fact that we ought always to be ready for his return. And so we kind of covered these in broad scale, and to give the students kind of an equipping of how do we think about the end times? How do we deal with the end times? How do we deal with people who are kind of obsessed with the end times? And, how do we live faithfully in that? So first is the fact that he will come back. And I made it very clear that none of the other points about the end times matter if we allow ourselves to be convinced that Christ isn't coming back. And this is a problem. This has been a problem within the church since the apostolic era. In fact, Second Thessalonians is written to a group of believers who are being taught by a group of false teachers and at danger of being convinced that Christ's return either isn't happening or already did happen or isn't bodily happening or is only spiritually happening, whatever it may be. But they're being taught by a group of false teachers that they're wrong about the end times and that Christ isn't actually coming back how they think and how he said. And so we talked about that, right? That was an issue then. It's certainly an issue now. And there are certainly believers now who will say, no, Christ isn't coming back. That's allegory. That's just a story. That's whatever it may be. If we're going to learn anything about the end times, first and foremost, we got to learn that, yes, Christ is coming back as a physical person. He's coming back. He's coming back in the clouds. He's bringing us with him. We have to accept that. We have to know that before we can move forward and learn anything else about them. And then the second thing we looked at was the fact that nobody knows the day or the hour or the time, and that we shouldn't be deceived by people who say that they do. Christ tells his disciples in Mark 13, 4 or 5 times explicitly, be on guard, do not be deceived, do not be deceived. He's very, very clear with his disciples that these attacks will come and that they need to be on guard against them. And how do they guard against them? By reminding themselves that nobody knows the day or the hour. And to illustrate this point, I actually went through and I cataloged a bunch of the times throughout church history and, history in general, that people have been convinced that the second coming was going to happen that year or in that 6-month period or even that day. They would list a date. And it took me close to 5 minutes just to read out the ones that are well documented. And the point being that if we were able to predict it, there wouldn't be exclusively incorrect predictions, right? And Christ himself would not say to his disciples, nobody can know the day or the hour except God the Father. And so we talked about that because that's something we really do need to be equipped in, that we don't get blown all about by these different theories and these different people and this person who's like, I calculated the day using this mathematical formula or whatever out of the book of Leviticus. And no, we need to be more even-keeled and level-headed, and we need to really trust Christ himself when he said that no one would know the day or the hour, right? The saddest thing about this is that Christians, people who take Jesus seriously, really ought to be the last people attempting to actually predict his coming. Why? Because he said we couldn't. And we're usually the first people, showing that maybe we don't take him seriously on everything he said, right? And then the last thing we saw was that we are to live a life of readiness. And this can be misconstrued, right? It can feel like living a life of readiness is kind of being on your guard for him to return, trying to predict his return, trying to predict every sign, trying to nail everything down. And really, I think what Christ is emphasizing as readiness in this chapter is just living a life of humble servanthood, of faithfulness to him, right? The parable he uses is a master who leaves his servants to their work, and he just doesn't tell them when he'll return. The master doesn't tell his servants that their being awake and being ready will be them predicting his return or them spotting the signs of his return. No, them being awake and being ready is doing the work that he left for them. And so for us being awake and being ready for the end times is not predicting every sign correctly, is not watching world events with the Bible in one hand. No, it's living a life of faithfulness. And when he comes back, we can look him in the eyes and we can say, I was doing the work that you left me to do. And so that is being ready. And so to follow up on this, you can read all of Mark chapter 13 if you would like. I think what I would say instead is to read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and to emphasize the fact that, yes, we will always have false teachers about the end times, and there always have been and there always will be, right? And to follow up, you can just ask your student, are you living a life of readiness? Are you living a life of readiness? Are you making use of the means that Christ has given you to be close to him now, to honor him now, to glorify him now? Are you doing the work he gave you to do? Or are you trying to save that for a later day? Because if so, you might be one of those servants who's caught with the master returning and you having to look at him and say, I didn't do any of the work, right? And we don't want to do that. We don't want to be that servant. We want to look him in the eyes and say, I've been doing the work that you left me to do. So ask your student, are you living a life of readiness? If not, how can you start doing that? That's all I have for you this week. Don't forget that this Saturday, March 15th, is our youth worship concert. It starts at 6:30. It's here at the church. Encourage your students to come. Encourage them to bring friends and family. It's going to be a really good time. Otherwise, see you Sunday.